I'm a CPS parent. I'm not a teacher. I'm one of the few people on staff who didn't come out of the membership. That's my mic in the back, actually. I've got 3 sons, 2 of them in the schools and 1 on his way. But I'm also a member of Solidarity and want to talk a little bit sort of as a socialist in the labor movement and someone who's been a union organizer and activist prior to being at CTU, some thinking about how to understand this strike. And thanks everybody for bearing with us. I mean, honestly, it's been hard for anybody to even take a breath yet and start processing any of this. It was half the attraction in organizing this forum is to force all of us to start having to think this through and what the hell does this mean, what we've gone through in the last few weeks. It's kind of incredible to realize it was only a little over 2 weeks ago that there were marches of 30,000 people every day through downtown that we were all running around with. I want to first talk about how to evaluate the strike. And I think for us as socialists, as radicals in the labor movement, one of the critical things is that we are looking at this contract not just in a matter of the material wins and losses in it. There's plenty to talk about and evaluate on that front, but that we actually have to have a more political discussion about what's been accomplished here, something that understands this as a battle within a much larger war. And on that front, I think 2 key criteria for us in thinking about this is this question of looking at the political consciousness, both of our members and the public, and how that was impacted by this strike. We've been saying for the last couple of years that if we were going to go on strike and we were going to win, going out on strike and having decent picket lines would be wildly insufficient, right? That they needed to be nervous not just about whether we would leave the job, but what we would do with the free time. And that it was only under those conditions that this could have a much bigger impact. And I don't think it is an overstatement to say that the overwhelming majority of CTU members really believe that this was a strike against the neoliberal corporate education reform agenda, really do believe that this was a strike about the future of education in black and brown neighborhoods in particular, about the future of public education. And that was no small accomplishment, and we should be clear that this is not where our membership would have been 2 to 3 years ago, that it's been a lot of work over the last couple of years that not only introduced that dialogue with folks, but had to build the confidence amongst our membership that this type of a fight was even possible, that this wasn't just a setup to get our heads knocked off. I think this is true out in the public as well. Secondly, on the question of race, I really think one of the elements that will be underdocumented in kind of all the post-game write-ups about this strike and the fight that's been going on so far is the way that discussions around race have played out both within the union and outside of the union. That's probably in no small part because the people who do most of the documenting are white folks who aren't listening to WVON, but it's like, what's happened on Black Talk Radio, what's happened between our members and parents in Englewood, the protests and actions that have been created in the West Side, the visibility of the union around those issues has really been a transformative thing where, the Chicago Teachers Union is not historically seen as an ally to low-wage workers in this city, and the ability to shift that discussion was of huge significance, not just in terms of parent support, the poll that Brandon was talking about. I mean, it's really mind-blowing the extent to which the political damage to ROM was very much along race and class lines. Race, jumping out dramatically. The numbers in that only cover registered voters. So, you imagine that if you could really capture a much broader set of polling, you would actually see the racial disparities in support for the union on this only grow further. But what it meant for our members as well, when I mentioned this thing about building the confidence of the membership of the CTU, to be able to see, I spent the Friday before the start of the strike in complete panic and walked around Englewood to a number of different elementary schools that we worried that we were rather weak at and talked to parents who were picking up their kids just to see how people were feeling about it and literally could not find a parent who wasn't willing to express serious sympathy and support around the issues of the strike. And what that meant for the members at those schools and their willingness to take this strike a step further, I think it's hard to overstate. Another way to evaluate what's just happened really is to focus on looking at what the boss's agenda was. And we should be clear that their agenda was not nibbling around the edges or saving a few bucks here or there, but that they had a heavily political program in this. that their initial hopes, and they had to lower these hopes at several steps along the way, but if you look at what they were headed towards over the past 2 years, it was clear that they intended this contract fight to be an opportunity to drive a clear wedge between teachers and parents, between the union and the community. In fact, they saw race as likely playing in their favor, that the black community was an area where they could try to create a severe division between parents and the union itself. That they aimed to severely weaken the union, both on institutional grounds by gutting the contract, weakening grievance procedures, weakening our ability to sort of function on technical terms, but also organizationally, right? Numerous efforts to just demobilize and demoralize our membership. I think it's the best way to understand that whole longer school day waiver fight, that had been their intent. They certainly intended to cheapen the staff in dramatic ways and I really just make this cost a hell of a lot less. I think on all of those fronts, there was a pretty clear and decisive victory, on where we wound up on the other side. They also had a program of making school closings cheap, right? I mean, they had a program, and when we were negotiating over what the layoff policy is going to be, what we were bargaining over is how expensive is it to close down a school. I mean, that was the other side's agenda, very purely, paving the way for future privatization and disinvestment from low-income schools. And on that one, just in material terms, it's hard to say it's a conclusive victory in terms of what's in the contract. I think in terms of our ability to continue that fight and where our membership is at it and their understanding of the issues and alliances with parents and community members, the ability for us to have a political relationship with community organizations who really understood that our contract was not going to win air conditioners and small classes at every school, but that the success of the Chicago Teachers Union in this contract fight under this type of program was critical if we were going to build a real education justice movement around race and class lines in this city, if we were going to stop school closings. The fact that these community organizations supported us in that fight, I think, says something about the raising of political consciousness for all the partners involved. The other thing I just wanted to say was, connecting the dots between some of the speakers up here and why Solidarity would put together a panel of sort of this set of speakers and this set of topics. I think for us, when we look at, it's easy for us to all say that we didn't want just a modest contract campaign. Of course, we want something transformative and something that's a bigger deal than that. We wanted a fight that would help build a movement around, what real education reform could look like. We would want something that could shift the conversation on what education reform means, on what the role of the union is. And, you see bits and pieces of this, right? The fact that the Sun-Times hardly are cheerleaders, but every reference to DFER, the Democrats for Education Reform, where they used to get called an education advocacy group, every time they've been referred to in the paper in the last couple of weeks, they've made a point of saying that it's a group of hedge fund investors from New York. I mean, it's kind of a stunning development. Or where the Tribune runs a front page poll asking parents, whose education reform program do you support more, Rahm Emanuel's or the Chicago Teachers Union? The notable thing not being that people said more than 2-1 the teachers union, the fact that they lumped us in as education reformers, right? And there has been a shift in this conversation and around race. Certainly we hope this has been a transformative fight in the impact on other unions. I see a bunch of friends from my old local union who I know, organized a conference call of 4,000 of your members, 5,000 of their members in Chicago to discuss the teachers' strike and talking about Rahm and the racial issues raised by it. And frankly, something that in just clear terms, our contract does include some concessions, and the fact that we can come out the other side of that with the membership being confident that everything they won was through a fight and that that's the only way to continue it, these seem like key questions. So, what I want to, try to connect to with some of the other speakers is just to say that what it took to make a transformative fight possible, it wasn't an automatic set of things, that the actual tactics, that when you really look at sort of the tactics and strategies and demands that make that possible, some of them are a little bit risky. What we had to do really meant not just running around and telling our members that victory is dependent on you taking action and, da-da-da-da. We did have to put together a system-wide organizing department that was trying to recruit leaders, but it really had to be focused on turning them into organizers and cutting them loose a little bit. There is a reality that on the first day of the strike, 16 aldermen had their offices taken over by groups of up to 200 of our members, and that wasn't organized out of home base, there was a risk to taking on a strategy of openly calling the mayor racist and calling CPS an apartheid system. There was a risk in trying to talk to white teachers about how this had to be a fight about the loss of African American teachers. Brandon, you're wrong. Some of them get freaked out about that. There was a risk about entering into a real coalition with community organizations that wasn't just bogus, that the union didn't really just lead on, that, frankly, if this was going to be a legitimate coalition, it meant that we would have to take on tactics and events that we never would have done on our own. And it was a scary situation. I mean, taking on some of the economic issues that we've taken on, during the strike, just, as an anecdote for folks, that Hyatt rally downtown sort of got planned out of the strike headquarters. The 500 people or whatever it was that organized a second Hyatt rally in Hyde Park. That was a group of our members who independently had just done that because they had gotten really engaged on the TIF issues and wanted to pound Penny Pritzker, and somehow they organized 500 people to march on that site. And so, these things actually are a little bit scary. It means, first of all, to get there, we couldn't just stay where the membership was at. That we had to go a few steps beyond that and push some difficult discussions throughout the union, have some real debates about it, take some actions that built people's confidence that these weren't just lunatic issues for us to be taking on and that they could succeed. I mean, secondly, it's scary because it means the leadership isn't in control of all of these things. There's a very real element of democracy and independent action by our members that, can be unpredictable. And the other thing is the tactics that have a chance of succeeding on this front are frankly the plans that can lose. We could have run a much safer and more modest fight with a more guaranteed acceptable solution if acceptable meant modest gains or just trying to hold tight and not worrying about the big picture long term of what's coming. And it's easy for all of us to say, yeah, but we're all in a slow death anyway. The reality is leadership of an organization are dealing with leading a very large organization, and the losses in a fight like this are costly. Had this strike gone down in flames, which was not impossible, it was not impossible at any number of points along the way, had that happened, I mean, we really would have been dead meat. I mean, it would have been a very sad history lesson for the Chicago Teachers Union. And going back to Jen's earlier comment, I think, part of the role of what an independent rank and file that's having political discussions, that's, really going through a raising of their own political consciousness, as well as building their own organization. Part of that role, it's not just as a check on the leadership, it's also a part of building the confidence that allows them to go a few steps forward, further than people would necessarily be comfortable doing. There are inherent pressures on, the staff and leadership in these organizations, and not to mention bad advice coming from, 98% of other labor leaders and elected officials, in the city. And we need to give people the confidence that our membership is ready to take this fight on. And I think we've been successful on that along the way. When we had a rally, it was one of the first really large ones after I came on at the end of the previous school year when they took the 4% raise. About 2,000 people showed up to protest a Board of Education meeting after they had announced removing the CTU's 4% raise. Completely unplanned by anybody on the staff or the leadership, our membership decided to take that march across the street to the Bank of America building, because we had been doing some actions on Bank of America. One of these wonky issues that you worry was pushing things a little too far left or a little further than where people were willing to go. And it turns out that when we trusted our membership a little bit, people were willing to go further than anyone would have expected. So I just think it's a critical lesson to take out of this. And I think for us as socialists and radicals in the labor movement, part of our role does have to be keeping an eye on exactly that, looking for ways to push forward those issues and reject reducing what just happened to merely mobilization and an organizing model versus a servicing model. These things that you hear in the labor movement, all of which are true, but a little bit devoid of political content. That that yes, it was mobilizing and yes, it was organizing, but it was also taking on real democracy in the Union, real political debate, taking on race, taking on economics, taking on some of the difficult discussions, and having a little faith that, you know, people might get there, and, you know, folks did. So, thank you.